The shooting down of a Malaysian airliner over eastern Ukraine with a loss of 298 people is unquestionably the story of the moment. With me is Neil Buckley, the FT's East Europe editor. Obviously there's a lot of discussion about how this plane was shot down. It almost certainly was shot down. It's pretty much inconceivable that it was shot down by anybody other than the rebels, the pro-Russian rebels fighting the Ukrainian government. Would you agree with that?
I think it's important that we don't prejudge any investigation. Clearly the next step is to have an investigation into the crash itself and an investigation into who was responsible for firing the missile that does appear to have brought this plane down. But all the evidence at the moment, circumstantial though it is, points to the rebels. There were Facebook postings where the rebels claimed responsibility for downing what they thought was a Ukrainian military plane. And there have been wire intercepts released by Ukrainian security services of the rebels apparently discussing their grim discovery that this was a civilian plane. So the evidence points in that direction, although Russia is trying to claim that, or is claiming that that they detected activity by Ukrainian air defense installations in the area at the same time.
The one thing which is still unclear is where the pro-Russian rebels, assuming it was them, where they actually got this so-called Buk surface-to-air missile system from. They might have stolen it from the Ukrainian military, and there have been claims that they had managed to get something like this in the past. Alternatively, it might have been supplied by the Russians. That area is actually very uncertain, isn't it? We don't have much detail on that.
It's a very murky area. If it is indeed the rebels who fired the missile, there were reports, in fact, they themselves said they had obtained one of these systems from the Ukrainians. They'd stolen one of these from the Ukrainian forces at the end of last month. But the Ukrainians didn't seem to actually think the rebels had one. They themselves were saying this week that planes that were being shot down, military planes being shot down in the area, they thought could only have been shot down by Russia itself because the rebels didn't have the capacity to do it. So that whole area is very murky, but it is crucial because if the missile launcher it turns out, was supplied by Russia, then there is a sense of Russian responsibility for this situation, which isn't there if this was a Ukrainian launcher that fell into the wrong hands.
Let's talk about the general situation between Russia and the West over eastern Ukraine. We're at the end of a week in which the US has slapped a whole load of new sanctions on the Putin regime, on Russia, because of what it deems to be Russia's military support for the pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine. So that has happened. Where does all this leave President Putin? He's obviously very upset about those sanctions, but what does the West do next? What does he have to do? How do you see all that developing?
I think this takes what was already a very serious crisis, the most serious security crisis in Europe since the end of the Cold War, to a whole new level. And it puts immense pressure on President Vladimir Putin. If it is shown that the rebels were responsible, Russia has backed the rebels, and there will be enormous pressure on Mr. Putin to distance himself from those separatist fighters in Ukraine. There will be enormous pressure for even more severe economic sanctions to be brought against Russia. But German Chancellor Angela Merkel has called on Friday morning for an international diplomatic solution to this crisis as the only way in which we can end the fighting in eastern Ukraine. She says this will be difficult, it's not an easy path, but that is the only way out, and there has to be negotiation with Mr. Putin. Whether we like it or not, that's the way she says this has to be solved.
What's your overall guess, Neil? There are really two ways this could go. The shooting down of this airliner might potentially be the start of some kind of process that really does resolve these problems in eastern Ukraine. Alternatively, it could be the beginning of a much darker and more serious chapter in the Russia-West relationship. If you had to make a guess, which way do you think it's going to go?
You're absolutely right that we've faced that kind of fork in the road. Rather than guessing which way we'll go, I think it's very difficult. I think I would say that only that we all hope that this will be a turning point, and certainly in terms of the memory of the victims who died, caught up in effect in a conflict with which they have no connection, the international community will take responsibility for finding a way of ending this conflict and for engaging the Russians and really getting to the bottom of this. There may be a slight, something of a parallel with the downing of the Korean Airlines plane in 1983 by the Soviets, which was one of the last big dramas of the Cold War. A couple of years later, we had Mr. Gorbachev come on into power in the Soviet Union, and negotiations between Mr. Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, and we started the process towards the end of the Cold War. An optimistic scenario is that this proves to be the high point, the worst point of the crisis, and then we do now move to finding a resolution.
Thank you very much.